Hello, folks. Welcome back to WW2 TV. And this is technically part of our Monte Cassino and Beyond series, but actually we're kind of going a bit further afield than that. But what made the Tiger tank so feared by the Allies? Well, using the Italian campaign as a primary example, Peter Samsonov of the Tank Archives will look at the mystery. It's based on his new book, Achtung Tiger. The link's in the description below. There's my copy. He'll hold his copy up later on. I'll bring him in now. How are you doing today, Peter?
I'm doing great, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we just hope that the internet connection lasts long enough. Sorry.
Yeah. So as I said, I am Peter Samsonov, author of a couple of books, but most recent is Achtung Tiger: How the Allies Defeated Germany's Heavy Tank, published by a military history group. If you've never seen their slogan, it is footnotes or bust. This book is based primarily on primary sources, archive sources. Just flip to the bibliography. Bibliography is this thick, so if you are a fan of primary document, primary sources, this is going to be the Tiger book for you.
Cool. Good sales job. So we were just talking before going live, Peter. One of the issues with armor is that myths just won't go away, and people have decided decades ago about the merits of various tanks and their armor, their firepower, their mobility, etc., etc., etc. So when you're talking about something as iconic, mythic as the Tiger tank, before we get into some specifics, did your findings in researching this book surprise you, or was it more or less in line with what you'd thought before going into it?
I started the research for what became this book in 2016, 2017. So I would say that my opinion back then was not on the Tiger was not tremendously well informed. I knew surface level stuff, maybe a little bit more than your average World of Tanks player, but compared to what I know now, it was basically nothing. You're right that the Tiger, our opinion, well, the Tiger is not unique in that sense. Our opinion on every tank, every battle, every history, every stage of history is informed by society, popular culture, right? Very few of us go in the archives and start to base our opinions on primary documents, and not that you should, right? You definitely need to look at the research what people have written before you. And this is something that's actually tackled in the book, but not by me. There is a foreword and there is a preface written by Marcus Pullman and Ralph Ratz, who are German armor historians. Ralph Ratz, of course, being the director of the Deutsches Panzermuseum. And they talk about what is the Tiger? Like, not, it's a 56-ton German heavy tank. What is the Tiger in culture? What is the Tiger as we understand it today? And that is not the product of German engineering thought, or at least not only the product of German engineering thought. It is the product of wartime propaganda. It is the product of post-war mythology, where both kind of self-serving stories and memoirs, and then you have historians like Franz Kurowski, who leaned into these misconceptions. And there's a great video by Dr. Roman Teppel where he talks about Panzer races. And he says that all of these great achievements, you think Tiger, each Tiger destroyed 100 enemy tanks, 1,000 enemy tanks, right? And Dr. Teppel talks about his interviews with the Tiger races. And every single Tiger race will tell you, I did not destroy all these tanks. Not only did I not destroy all these tanks, I don't know how many tanks I destroyed. We didn't count. But in all these histories you see today, you'll see these, definitively auto carriers destroyed, 240 tanks, something like that, right? And those numbers are essentially made up. And you can find this video on YouTube. I'm not going to summarize Teppel's findings, but actually, the legend of the Tiger was written not just from 1942 to 1945, it was written from 1942 until today. And that is why this book, that's why my bibliography is so thick. It's why it's all primary sources. The idea here was to forget everything that happened since 1945, see what the people back then thought about it. And of course, it's not correct. Not all of it. There is a appendix of characteristics where you can compare what the actual values were. Let me see if I can find you an armor diagram. The first section is called Tiger Basics. So I'm sure all of your viewers have seen this, but here's a table of characteristics. Two versions. One was what the German government, German army considered to be correct. One is what Henschel considered to be correct, and these can differ quite significantly. So, for example, the mass of these two versions of the Tiger tank differs by 3,000 kilograms. The top speed is different. The average speed is different. So, even at the time, the Germans themselves had different ideas about what the Tiger can do. There's diagrams, technical rundown. If for some reason you don't really know anything about the Tiger at all and you buy this book, which you should, this kind of gives you a quick rundown of the very basic facts as we know them today. And so as you go through the book, it's split into two sections. One is the Soviet experience and one is the Anglo-American experience. And you can kind of see how they find these tanks, they know nothing about them, and they go from, what is this tank? It kind of looks like a Panzer IV, but it's bigger. It's probably a Panzer VI because we read about those in all these telegrams we intercepted. And they start learning more about it, and at the end, they're basically get to the point where, Jan, the Tiger is old news. We know everything about it. Tell us more about these other new emerging threats in the battlefield. And it's this. So this book is a book about technical intelligence. There is description of combat. There is description of combat in Italy, as we will talk about over the next little bit. But the description of the combat only serves to illustrate the points discovered in the technical trials. So the majority of this book is, in a way, like you say, serves to address these myths. So you'll hear about how the Tiger was invincible. Shermans couldn't do anything to it. Six-pounders couldn't do anything to it. It just ruled the battle, drove around until it ran out of fuel. Well, not really. In the first trials conducted by the Soviets and the first trials conducted by the British, there's a great big list of guns that can shoot through a Tiger, guns that can't. Obviously, many guns can't, but there's no point at which there were no weapons that could defeat a Tiger. Of course, the Tiger was invincible is a much more memorable kind of quote than, well, it could be penetrated by a Sherman, but only at an angle of less than 10 degrees and only at a range of 400, 500 meters. Those are the technical details that don't really make it your Netflix documentaries or History Channel documentaries. But if you are really into the technical details, if you want to know particularly about penetration tables, there's penetration tables of what the Tiger could achieve as well. Taken from German sources. There's trials that were done by both the Soviets and the British to see for themselves how much the gun penetrates. So tons and tons and tons of technical data. If you're one of those tank nerds that goes in World of Tanks forums or War Thunder forums and says, well, actually the gun in the game needs to be buffed by 5 millimeters and 10% precision or whatever, it's going to be a book for you.
Well, that sounds good. And one of the things that we get a lot on the comments on this channel is about armor. People have an opinion that the Sherman blowing up all the time. We did a myth show on that with the Chieftain, in fact, and it got lots of feedback. People agreeing with him, people saying he was completely wrong. People, and one of the things you said earlier, which I think is interesting, is that, of course, it wasn't like it was the amateurs that built this idea of German stuff being invincible. It was largely NATO derived, because in the 50s and 60s, the NATO has to prove that having small amounts of good things is better than having large amounts of less good things, because the Allies had kind of won World War II. This is a very basic, simplistic view, by having more of a slightly simpler design than the Axis that had fewer of a better design. So to prove that those pesky Ruskies in the Cold War were not going to win, we had to prove that our stuff, which was we had less numbers of, was better than their stuff. So to me, that's where this whole idea of the Germans being invincible came from, because it was NATO's need to sell the NATO approach. But now we're beyond the Cold War now, so it's probably absolutely the right time to go back and examine where this stuff comes from. So let's before the Italian campaign, obviously the first place they really encountered the Tiger was Tunisia, and then a little on the Eastern Front as well. So you said earlier about the first time they appeared, no one knew what they were. As you said, they looked like a big Panzer IV. So what was the viewpoint of the first Allied soldiers or Soviet soldiers who saw them? What did they think?
Well, so the way that the two sides encountered the Tiger tank was slightly different. The Soviets had no idea. They weren't by the British that, hey, the Germans have this new Tiger tank, or sorry, Panzer VI tank. We don't know anything about it. We know it's new. And the Soviets went, okay, haven't seen any. At this point, 4 Tigers had been employed next to Leningrad. They all, in August of 42, they all broke down and achieved none. Soviets didn't notice them. There was one that was stuck in no man's land for months. The Germans didn't want to demolish it, but they also couldn't evacuate it because the engineering half tracks that were used to evacuate the Tiger, these ones are Kraftfahrzeuge 9. It's unarmored. It's massive. If you ever see one in a museum, they have it in components. It's a huge, tempting target, and you need 3 of them to pull a Tiger. So they couldn't do anything. They demolished it. A couple months later, the Soviets never found about it. It was only discovered a couple of years ago, I think, the remains of it. In Tunisia, North Africa, there was some intelligence, and I kind of go through it. There's also an article on my blog, Tank Archives. It's called Tigers in Tunisia. If you Google it, you'll find it. Essentially, the British knew about this Tiger tank. There was a photo that was published in some German magazine, I forget, which they used to even get line drawing, estimated its dimensions. But Tigers, it was sort of the same type of employment. They arrived in Tunisia piecemeal. By that time, the Germans had already been on the run for ages. So the Tiger, of course, being a breakthrough tank, didn't actually get to break through anything. It was the Tigers that arrived in Tunisia were used to defend Tunisian ports to set up an evacuation of the Afrika Korps. They were used in battle. They didn't really achieve much, and really all they did was gift the British technical intelligence. So the Germans are pretty good about demolishing their tanks, but even from a demolished tank, you can see, okay, this chunk of armor is the thickest. It's probably going to go in the front. It's got some roof attached to it, so the roof, you can figure out the thickness of the roof, etc., etc. There were some intact Tiger hulls that were recovered and shut up. There were some Tiger hulls that were shut up in place because you couldn't pull them out through a minefield. And then, of course, the capture of Tiger 131. Didn't really want to focus on it because it's not a book about Tiger 131. It's a book about all Tiger tanks. But of course, there's a chapter on the capture and trials of 131. And so there is a quote that I have in here. I can't find it at the moment. I should have bookmarked it, but I can paraphrase it. It's from an AFV technical summary report from spring of 1943. And it says, hey, this Tiger tank, there's few of them and it didn't really achieve anything. We can't be complacent. We need to develop our own tank that can fight this Tiger on equal footing. Because at that point, the strongest thing the British had was a Churchill 3 or Churchill 4. It's got a six-pounder gun. They can penetrate the front of a Tiger from a couple of hundred yards. The Tiger can penetrate it in return from a much greater distance. Even though technically the Tiger has thinner armor on the front, it's 100 millimeters, and the Churchill's is 102. The Tiger has a much more powerful gun and the other advantages as well. This warning, as far as I can tell, was not taken seriously. And the Tiger's lackluster performance in Italy, which we will cover, I cover it in detail in this book. In particular, I transcribe a portion of a report called Tiger Killed Himself. It kind of spoils the conclusion of the report, but essentially the idea was that these tanks are not a threat. They're big, they're heavy, they have thick armor and a big gun, fine. They're far too unreliable, there are far too few of them to actually have any kind of effect on the battlefield. And then they landed in Normandy, and that was a whole different story. But that's getting a bit ahead of myself.
So, I mean, it's fascinating what you're saying. So, a conclusion was they're not a threat, and yet tiger fear was definitely a thing in World War II. And it definitely, you've already established, it became a big thing post-war. So, where did the tiger fear come from? Was it a particular couple of examples? Was it rumors that were not quashed by the right people? Was it misinformation, or was it kind of a mixture of everything?
It's a mixture. On my blog, I have some raw, unrefined intelligence reports, and sometimes you look at it and you say, what were these people smoking? This is fiction. This is like this no such tank ever existed. One that comes to mind is this report about a tank called Panda S. They're saying this prisoner of war was saying, oh, it's got a bigger gun than the Tiger, more powerful gun, thicker armor, it's faster, it's better all around. And you think, no, there was no such tank. What are you talking about? But then you kind of need to, you know how kind of like with a magic picture, you might focus your eyes a little bit, then that's when the picture comes together. If you look at this intelligence report and focus your eyes metaphorically, you could see that this is a panther.
Right.
Whoever was transcribing the interrogation wrote panda instead of panther. I don't know, maybe they misheard, but it has a longer gun than the Tiger that penetrates more armor. Its front armor is more effective because it's sloped. It's faster than the Tiger. So this kind of thing is intelligence is not built from one report. That's why intelligence summaries were a thing. You need to collate a bunch of reports together and say, okay, we've analyzed 10 reports. They're all wild nonsense. But if you look at 10% of each report, makes like it aligns in between all the reports. People are saying roughly the same thing. So that's probably true. That's something that we need to look into. So there were some information that made through that was confirmed. Lots more information that was unconfirmed and probably wrong. The other thing is that the Tiger was a mystery for quite some time. So the Tiger appears in August of 1942, then in North Africa a little bit later. It's not really used or noticed by either the Soviets or the Western Allies until January of 43. And even at that point, it's not used in large numbers until Kursk. So it was this kind of mystery. And one of the mysteries was how many of these tanks the Germans producing. We don't know. The estimate by the British made was 500 Tigers per month. There were 1347 Tigers built in total ever in between 1942 and 1944. So the estimate was wildly off, but they're expecting these massive amounts of tanks, and these aren't there. So where are they? They must be being built up somewhere as a reserve. And I haven't seen this on the British side, but on the Soviet side, they took the appearance of the Tiger very seriously. The information pamphlets about the Tiger were disseminated to the lowest levels. There were actually quizzes that were done in frontline units about the Tiger tank and its identification and its weaknesses and whatnot. And so naturally, if there's so much attention paid to the Tiger tank, you're going to see it in your dreams. You're going to see it behind every bush. Despite your best intentions, obviously, right now, someone who's played a lot of World of Tanks or seen a lot of documentaries can look at a tank and go, yes, that's a Panzer IV ASF-J produced between, January 45 and March 45, and they can tell because of the distinctive shape of the cupola, and exhaust pipes are pointing 10 degrees to the right or something like that. Back then, there's pictures of tanks that are just right there in front of the photographer. And you can see them take a picture of even a Tiger, and it's captured Panzer IV, right? Or a German take a picture of it, MS-1 tank dug in as an immobile bunker. And on the back, it's signed a T-34 Russian heavy tank. So back then, people just weren't as good at identifying Tigers or any other kind of tank as we would be today. It wasn't really important to them because to an infantryman, you have better things to worry about. If you see kind of a tank-like shape in the distance, whether or not it's a Tiger, it doesn't really matter, because if it's a Panzer IV or really a Panzer I, you're just as dead if it sees you. So you're probably going to focus on learning other things to survive than, okay, this is this particular type of tank. We're going to, I don't know. I would shoot it with a six pounder on the side. Do I have a 6-pounder? No, it doesn't really matter. And then obviously this is something that it's talked about as well in the foreword, is the Tiger was the first German tank that had a name. So if you're gathered around the campfire with your friends and you're saying, oh, you know, I read about this Sonderkraftfahrzeug 181. Oh, I bet it's a real, no one cares, right? It's a bunch of letters and numbers and inventory codes, but you say Tiger. And that's what Marcus Pohlmann writes, is Tiger is the name of a beast. And that kind of worked to create this mythos aura of mystery, of danger around it. The Germans, I mean, they definitely had more powerful weapons by the end of the war than the Tiger, or weapons that you were more likely to encounter. Even the Panther, but the biggest tank killer, you know, wasn't a Tiger or a Panther, it was a Pak-40. Is the Pak-40 really feared and well known? Not really. So yeah, it's definitely kind of that combination of incorrect information and the information vacuum being filled in by the troops themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I like the fact that you talked about the fact that they were relatively rare when they first appeared, because them being a bit elusive helps build the legend. If everybody saw one every day, they would be less scary, isn't it? But if you don't see it very often, then rumor becomes more, you know, becomes spread, and then people start saying, oh, there's this thing down the road. I heard the New Zealanders were up against it last week. Oh my God, it's deadly. And if you haven't actually seen it yourself, it's like in life generally, you build up a worse picture of a scenario than actually reality is. You know, there's things I put off doing because, you know, like my annual accounts, for example, I put off doing it because in my head, it's going to be terrible. And actually, when I do it, it's really fairly easy. It's not that scary at all, but in my head, it is. I'm not comparing folks, me doing my accounts to the fear of Tiger tanks, but there is a parallel. And as a Normandy guy, I've never met an American British veteran who talks about the danger of a Marder or a Stug, and yet I can take you to most battlefields where they knock out more Allied vehicles than Tiger tanks did. But that, you know, veterans don't meet together and talk about the fear, as you say, of a Pak-40 or a Marder, but Tigers, they do. That's just became how it was.
Yeah, and I mean, that's I cover it in the book a little bit, and there was interviews with the chieftain, interviews with Sologa, where they talk about it as well. Is this Tiger legend from the U.S. forces, where they say, oh, you know, we fought 10 Tiger, or 1 Tiger drove up and blew up all our Shermans, and you know, in Fury, right? What's the big tank opponent? It's the Tiger.
Yep.
Saving Private Ryan, what's the big tank opponent? It's the Tiger.
Kelly's
the Americans fought Tigers 3 times, or sorry, saw Tigers 3 times in Normandy. Almost all Tiger encounters were with British forces, and not the American.
And that's worth remembering. So, well, we've got a few questions building up, so I might as well put some of them to you. So, Mad Cat is saying, were the Allies aware of the tank upgrading warfare because of the Eastern Front? So were the Western Allies getting information about tank warfare from the Eastern Front? Because let's be honest, the Eastern Front had way more tank-on-tank action than the Western did. I hope I'm correct in that. You're the tank expert, but that's my interpretation. So are the Western Allies looking at the Eastern Front for tank data, so to speak?
Yes. So from the very earliest setups of this Anglo-American Soviet cooperation, the British wrote that they are the Soviets are very reluctant to talk about their own tanks. The Soviets are very reluctant to talk about British tanks in combat with Soviet units. The Soviets love to talk about German tanks. They will show everything to you, talk about it. There's actually quite a few German tanks recovered on the Eastern Front sent to the UK.
Right.
Not Tigers, not that I know of, but at least one Panther after Kursk was sent. Panzer IIIs were sent. There's a document from the British archives that I have where they say, we haven't found any Panzer IIIs with surface hardened armor, but we have a whole bunch from the Eastern Front that were sent to us, Panzer IVLs, or sorry, Panzer IIILs with surface hardened armor. So they're coming from somewhere, stuff like that. Technical intelligence as well. There was a couple of diagrams that I see in Soviet publications, and then a couple of months later, the same diagram, exactly the same diagram, shows up in technical trends, American publication, or somewhere in a document. So there's definitely a very active exchange of intelligence about German tanks circulating through the entire war. And like I mentioned before, it went both ways, right? So the British notified the Soviets about, hey, we heard about this new tank. We don't know anything about it, but, keep an eye out. Same thing with the Tiger, too. There's a document on my blog about General McFarlane asking if the Soviets had seen a tank called the Tiger Imperial, which was, of course, the Royal Tiger, the King Tiger. But this was at such early stages, all right, of studying this tank that they didn't even know the name of it. But yeah, there was a back and forth for sure. How much specifically, if any tanks were ever upgraded just because of intelligence that came from the Soviets, it's hard to say. Like I said, the people who were doing upgrading of the tanks, they were at the tail end of summaries of reports. So it definitely contributed to it. I don't know. It's hard to say whether it was entirely responsible for any design change.
Okay. So we're meant to be talking about Italy because that's the week. So Ian is asking, did the Allies develop weapons to specially counter the Tiger on its own, or were they more worried about Panthers? So we've talked about the rather undecided nature of the Italian campaign. Some people didn't want to go at all. Then there's Salerno, there's Anzio, then there's Rome or Monte Cassino. But in the planning stages, is there any real built-in plans about the Tiger? And if not the Tiger, what are the built-in worries in terms of German armor? Or are there any from the Allied point of view?
So the good news about the British is a lot of people knock them for their excessive conservatism. But in this case, they stacked up everything correctly, I think. So in 1938, they began developing a new high-velocity six-pounder. And it's a sort of lethargic thing because, at that point, the two-pounder was perfectly fine, and they had no money. The army has no budget, but still, you have this tank, Matilda, or what was going to be called the Matilda. It has armor powerful enough to bounce a two-pounder shot. So what's to say the Germans can't develop something like this themselves? We need to modernize our weapons proactively. This gun was in development, and then even more powerful gun came into development, the 17-pounder. And the 17-pounder at the time was not meant to defeat really armor close up. It was meant to defeat armor like something like Panzer IV, but at the range that could be expected in North Africa. So 2,000 yards, 3,000 yards. And this is stated outright in documents like, hey, this is the use case for this type of weapon. 6-pound penetrate the front of a Panzer IV from range of a point, about 1,000 yards, right? at that range, the Panzer IV can still penetrate our tanks. In return, we need a greater range. So rather than thickening the armor of our tanks, we need to improve the guns so we can hit it at a longer range. So by the time the Tiger turned up, the British already had the 6-pounder, and the British had this 17-pounder. And in the first trials against the Tiger tank, they find out, okay, well, the 6-pounder can penetrate it. 17-pounder it from a range of, I think it was 1,800 yards, the front. But they say the shot, at the time, the British were not using armor-piercing shells. They were using solid shot, saying the shot is brittle. It penetrates, but the beyond the armor effect is limited, or it can shatter during penetration and not penetrate as effectively. And so it wasn't that brand new weapons had to be developed to combat the Tiger specifically. They were saying, okay, we need to improve the quality of our existing ammunition. And there is some notes about APDS as well, or just new types of ammunition as opposed to improving existing types. But generally, the British were satisfied with the anti-tank performance, the 17-pounder. They didn't really, during the entire war, develop a more powerful gun. Interestingly enough, there is, veering off topic a little bit, there was a diagram of the Panther that said the front is just, don't shoot the 17-pounder at it. It's not, as they put it, not unprofitable. Attack with a 17-pounder is unprofitable. And there was a small portion on that diagram of the gun that's okay, you can shoot here from several hundred yards. In reality, it turned out to be very different. There's a revised diagram that shows the Panther to be much, much more vulnerable to the 17-pounder. And of course, due to the declining quality of German steel, the front of the Panther could be penetrated by even APC-BC. You didn't need APDS to do it. But yeah, that was the kind of understanding of Allied weapons versus the Tiger. The Soviets, on the other hand, didn't have an equivalent of a 17-pounder, so there was a little bit of a panic in April, May of 43 when the Tiger went through trials and said, "Oh, we really need to get it together." Uncancel some guns canceled back in 1941 because they weren't necessary. Adapt anti-aircraft guns for use in tanks, and so all of these new weapons kind of started coming into effect early 1944. I actually have a running tally of kind of number of Tigers and number of vehicles that could defeat them that were in the field. And sort of by mid-1944, there's 5 or 6, probably more types of tanks or tank destroyers out on the field can destroy Tiger at a range of 2,000 meters. And each type individually outnumbers the total number of Tiger tanks ever produced. So kind of like you said, the objective was to build more tanks that worked as good. In this case, they had tanks that were just as good, but there were much, much, much more of them.
That's a really good point. So running through that again, there's 6 or 7 types of Allied vehicle, each of which can knock out a Tiger at 2,000 yards. And each of those types, there are more made than Tigers. That's a really cool bit of data. I really like that. And so let's look at a couple of questions because they're piling up. So Mark Stanton will deal with his first. Was the Tiger designed more for an occupying army instead of an army moving fast and taking ground over large distances? The logistics behind a Tiger appear troublesome. So, I mean, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? The reliability of Tigers. The Wereaboos say they are fantastic, and the people who on the other side say they broke down all the time. So, is it really not an ideal design for where the Germans are moving with their war plans come the middle of the war?
Yeah, that's correct. So Tiger arose from a program that started in about 1938, and it was called, not surprisingly, Druckwagen, literally breakthrough vehicle. So the idea was the Germans created a series of heavy tanks with 80 millimeters of front armor, 80 millimeter being enough to resist their most powerful gun at the time, which was the 5-centimeter Pak. And so the idea was, in 1938, Germany was staring down a number of fortifications, the Maginot Line, the Czech fortifications, etc. And so they would need a kind of tank with thick armor that could get close up to a bunker and fire not at that point not yet high velocity shells, although the Flak 36, the 88 millimeter Flak, definitely proved itself as a powerful bunker buster. At that point, they were just shooting either short, low velocity 75 millimeter HE or low velocity 105 millimeter HE. And so as the Tiger evolved, the requirements were bumped up in 1941 to the 88 millimeter gun to 100 millimeters of armor, so it kind of grew thicker, heavier. Its mission never changed. It was a breakthrough vehicle. The idea, you're right, is that there is a relatively shallow line of defenses that's very strong, but it's not very, it's maybe a couple of dozen kilometers deep. We need to have a can opener, right? Punch through those fortifications, and that's it. It doesn't need to go anywhere. It doesn't need to be used in a pursuit role. We have faster medium tanks for that. By the time the Tiger was actually on the battlefield in April 1942, in August 1942, there wasn't really any fortifications left to break. On the Eastern Front, we have Leningrad, where they were sent. The defenses there, they weren't fortifications. They were rivers, swamps, right? With entrenched infantry, but you can dig out entrenched infantry with the Panzer IV if you really need to. And there wasn't much going on in Western Europe at the time. So these Tiger tanks, they tried to put them in a breakthrough role in Kursk. That didn't really work. For the majority of the time, Tigers were used as this kind of tank destroyer. And as the Americans found out, the core of a tank destroyer was speed. Right, you need to not just sit there and wait for the enemy to come to you. You need to reposition to counter an enemy spearhead, and the Tiger was not built for that. Especially as the situation on the German front lines continued to deteriorate, you needed more and more of these firefighting teams, and so the Tiger was employed in heavy tank battalions, Schwerpanzerabteilung. Very rarely were they actually used in battalion strength. Most of the time, especially in Italy, they were broken up into companies or even in platoons and deployed independently. It was kind of this idea of, okay, there's a crisis developing here, we're going to send a company there. There's a crisis developing here, we're going to send a company there. And then local commanders would go, okay, I have a big front line, not enough Tigers to put them in. Split it up until you have individual Tigers kind of ineffectively flailing about. It's pretty much exactly the same thing that happened with T-34s and KVs in the summer of 1941. As the situation continues to deteriorate, you're driven to more and more desperate kind of actions. And once a tank is to an infantryman, this mobile fortress, completely invincible. What am I going to do to it? Probably nothing. I'll run away. I'll sit in my foxhole until it drives away. To an engineer, to a mechanic, a tank is this sort of fine clockwork mechanism that's always on the verge of breaking down. You need to pull out its air filters and clean them every couple of hours. And in Italy, in dusty conditions in North Africa, more often than that, you'll need to do it. You need to wipe off old grip of everything, relubricate everything. You need to check. And if you've ever seen an oiling diagram for a Tiger, it's this, tiny little picture Tiger in the middle, and it's got arrows pointing for every single part of it. And most of the diagram is text saying, here's each individual component you need to oil. And this is regular maintenance that had to be done. And if your Tiger is off somewhere, the crew is shoving meth down their throats because they haven't slept in 48 hours, they're not going to be doing it. They don't have the resources to stop, refuel, fit, right? And the Tiger as a heavy tank is particularly more sensitive to this kind of abuse. And so, yeah, tanks broke down. And if a tiger breaks down as a part of a tiger battalion, okay, awesome. Get the engineering company out, get their half tracks, we'll cover its retreat. If a tiger breaks down as a part of this independent company, independent platoon, it's there forever. The infantry is not going to be able to pull it out. They can bring up horse carts or something. And that's why in Italy, one of the reasons why you see tigers have such a limited effect is when a tiger broke down, they could only pull it out with another tiger. And that tiger itself would then break down because the transmission wasn't rated for that kind of load. And there's an episode that I describe where you start with a company of tigers. They try to cross a railway embankment. They scoop up some dirt with their long barrels, and they had to stop, clean the guns out immediately. When they're stopped, someone sees them, calls in artillery. The artillery doesn't really do much direct damage, but a shell splinter punctures the radiator of one of the tigers, and it overheats. It's pulled by another tiger. The tiger's transmission breaks down. Those two tigers are then by two more tigers, and those tigers suffer technical damage as well. It's through this kind of domino effect. These tigers never saw combat. Like, they were shot at indirectly at some point, and that's it. All of the tigers break down. Two captured Sherman without turrets are used as tractors to salvage one of the remaining tigers, and that tiger is then demolished because they can't evacuate her any further. So it's this kind of, obviously this isn't a typical employment of a tiger, but it serves to illustrate that, unless tank again is employed correctly and has that support tail, it'll break down. It's not going to be like, I hear all these questions of hypotheticals all the time, like, oh, what if the Germans had the Maus tank? What if the Soviets had the IS-2 in 1941? What if, I don't know, the British had an Abrams in France? The outcome is going to be the same, because the reason why these campaigns went the way they did isn't because of the firepower armor of any one individual tank. It was the cohesion of the units that supported the tank. It was the cohesion of the infantry and the artillery and the aircraft that went into battle with that tank. Because a tank, even a heavy tank, or even a heavy tank unit, is the spearhead. But to use that spearhead, you need a shaft. Yeah. And so in both the Soviets and the British and the Americans, and it's all in the book there, I compare the experiences. Tiger is, in popular culture, is a solitary hunter that lurks around the battlefield, and it has this noble knight duel with one-on-one with all these in T-34s, and it wins every time. This was probably the exception rather than a typical scenario, because both the British and Soviets note that a tiger is used as a cog in the combined arms machine. Yeah, tigers never fight alone. They're used in conjunction with medium tanks. If there's a lot of tigers, they're used as a spearhead. If there's not a lot of tiger tanks, they're used in the reserve. It always fights with assault guns. It always fights with artillery, right? And so that's why a lot of these instructions on fighting tiger tanks are actually about how to fight the units that support them. Because without this support, the tiger's effectiveness is limited. Its duration of the field is limited. And if you suppress the infantry around it, because a tiger always has a close infantry escort, the tigers might even turn back once they realize they're alone. So
but we're starting to get to where the mythology comes from, because then they're being used as kind of firefighters by the Germans. So they're coming in kind of in the key moments when they're being sent in a small, group, a battalion rather than any more, or a company. They maybe not be there for very long. Then they get knocked out, or they get pulled out somewhere else. And if you're an Allied soldier, you're not seeing the entire German army. You don't see the artillery. The artillery is almost an abstract concept. You're not seeing that, but there is this tiger somewhere there on the battlefield. And the fact that the less you see them, the more the fear seems to generate. So I think we are getting where with this. I mean, as we've said on this channel many times, the top trumps approach to tanks or aircraft is the Mustang compared against the 109 or the Tiger against the Sherman. That's not how the armies engage. That's not how it's a doctrine against doctrine or army against army. But we'll do with a few more questions because I really like David O'Keefe's song because we're meant to be talking about Italy. So David O'Keefe, historian, ultra, Bletchley, very average, all that stuff. Can you take us through how a British-American crew would have faced the Tiger and then take us how the Soviets would have dealt with it? Or did they not have a specific way of dealing with a Tiger? Because you kind of hinted at that earlier on. In Italy, all the Allies are more worried about, they're concerned about Axis armor, but not specifically types. So address that question if you wouldn't mind.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, I have two appendices. One is instructions that were being given to Soviet officers at a very high level. It's all very dry and boring, but it tells you kind of the basics of how they would fight a Tiger tank. And the other is the same instructions that would have been adapted for NCOs, enlisted men, privates, which are much more colorful. They're full of kind of inspiring quotes. They're full of colloquialisms. They detail pretty much the same information. But maybe more accessible to this kind of non-professional soldier. So in order to fight a Tiger tank as a part of, so this is Kursk era, 1943. Tiger's its greatest enemy at this point is an anti-tank gun belt. So the biggest Tiger killer you would have is almost certainly a 76mm ZIS-3 gun, which can't really take out a Tiger very long range. In the side, couple 100 meters, maybe a bit more, you use APCR, but you might have 1 or 2 APCR shells per gun, or a dozen per battery, or something like that. So you are saving them up to hit the Tiger really at close range. You're firing from a prepared position. Every single anti-tank is going to have multiple prepared positions. So the idea is fire, relocate, fire, relocate, fire, relocate. Because if in an anti-tank gun, your only defense is your size. You're spotted, you're dead.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned before, the instructions say you need to deal with all of these other things around the Tiger. So a Soviet tank destroyer unit is going to have a mix of 45mm and 76mm guns. Now, a 45mm gun can penetrate the armor of a Tiger. The range at which it can do that is short. 200, 300 meters if you hit in that this part here under the under this gutter, right, and the wheels, very tiny portion of the track, or back where you can see it, and you can penetrate there with a 2-pounder 40mm gun. You can penetrate there with a 45mm gun. You could probably penetrate there with an American 37. I know in some penetration tables they have data for that, and it's like 150 yards. I've never seen any trials to confirm it, and I've never seen any after-action reports that confirm it. But yeah, the Soviets were not thrilled about the chances of tackling a Tiger with a 45mm gun. And so the 45mm gun was directed to combat infantry, the medium tanks that are supporting the Tiger. Usually the battery closest to the Tiger would engage it. But you need to have the rest of the batteries in your platoon need to fight everything else. The self-propelled guns that are coming up. So you fight the Tiger as one big cohesive unit. Kind of how, like, the whole 5 Shermans to a Tiger thing. The 5 Shermans, it's not because one Tiger can destroy 4 Shermans. It's because 5 Shermans is the smallest amount of Shermans you have in one platoon. Later on, the odds change a little bit. So in 44, 45, you now have this newcomer on the scene, the IS-2. And so the IS-2s, even though it's not their primary purpose, but the document that accompanied the first IS-2s and the first IS-2 152s, it's outright states that these are breakthrough heavy tanks, breakthrough heavy SPGs, but they also have powerful anti-tank effects. So they can be used as a reserve to fight enemy heavy tanks, and this did happen a lot of the time. And what it says there is a 122 or 152 millimeter gun can destroy a Tiger at essentially any range at which it can hit. So in return, the Tiger can't knock out an IS-2 from a very long range. I think even the Germans don't claim that it can do it. It's anything more than a couple of 100 meters. So make advantage of that invulnerability envelope. Fire at Tigers from a long range, right? You would have a screen of medium tanks. It's kind of the same thing as the Germans were doing. Is the IS-2s don't fight alone. A Guards heavy tank brigade is a building block in an attack, and so you would have IS-2s in a second echelon, and since their guns are so long range, they would actually fire over top of that first echelon of medium tanks to engage the enemy. And this is around the time when the Germans realize, the Tiger is no longer top dog on the battlefield. And there's excerpts from that in this book. An IS-2 should not be engaged by Tiger tanks in anything less than a platoon strength. A Tiger can no longer ignore the laws of combat. You can't just drive up on the crest of the hill, have a look around. They list a few other weapons in addition to the IS-2, but it's very clearly that most of the document is about the IS-2 and how, okay, you can't just effortlessly win one-on-one anymore. In terms of the Allies, like I said, they didn't really give the Tiger due credit until Normandy. It appeared in very small numbers. It didn't have much of an effect in North Africa. It didn't have much of an effect in Italy on that sort of strategic scale. And so most concerns were about the type of tank warfare you saw in France in 1940. It's these armored spearheads, fast-moving, encircling, bypassing kind of force concentrations. And that's where the American tank destroyer doctrine came from. It was, we need a tank destroyer that's fast. It needs a heavy gun. We don't really need that much armor because we're firing from an ambush. You're essentially a mobile anti-tank gun. So the American sorry, my internet hiccuped for a second. It was kind of in a way similar to what the Soviets with their anti-tank guns, but just a little bit more mobile.
So, there's an interesting kind of paradox here, because the sidebar conversation is all about the terrain of Italy is not conducive to Tiger warfare, bridges, mobility, etc., etc., etc. Brad from OTD Military History is saying he's done a video about the Canadian, how to knock out a Tiger tank. They were knocked out there. You're saying it wasn't their greatest arena of combat. The Soviets are now saying that with the IS-2 that it's no longer the top dog on the battlefield. But you said it yourself. The Allies go into Normandy with this, we're still with this fear of the Tiger. So why is the question? What is it? Is it the Tiger that they're afraid of, or is it something doctrine, or is it something that they can't explain? What I know we're meant to be talking about Italy, but what I'm just fascinated by why, if it isn't top dog on the battlefield, it's still in the minds of the Allies.
That I'm not sure. On the technical intelligence front, it's all about the Panther now. There's a questionnaire, POW questionnaire that I refer to, and it's actually quite disappointing reading this document, where it's these two columns or three columns. And you have the question, POW responses pertaining to the Panther, POW responses pertaining to the Tiger. And the Panther ones are so detailed. There's tons of information coming in about the Panther, how it's used, its technical weaknesses, its technical strengths, supply situation, everything. And on the Tiger side, every other question is something like unknown, can't be established, some information but not definitive. So it's so close that, like, if that report had been complete, it would have made my Normandy chapter would have been 3 or 4 times longer. But as such, there actually was not a lot in that Normandy bit. And I read, as a part of this, another great type book, which, if you can find it, you should obtain it. But they go for hundreds of dollars, unfortunately, on eBay. Newsom's Tiger Tank Analytic Intelligence. And it's a very different book from mine. It kind of focuses on that psychological aspect. And his thesis is that the bigwigs, the brass, they knew everything about the tiger and how devastating it was. They kept it from their own soldiers because they knew it would shatter their morale. I disagree with that conclusion. But it's clear that he did his research, and he references a lot of the same reports that I do. And when it gets to Normandy, it just kind of gets dry as well. So the technical intelligence branch did not really concern themselves with the tiger anymore at that point. They were focused on the panther. The king tiger showed up, and they go, "Oh no, not again!" Everything about the king tiger at that point. The tiger is kind of old news. So I don't know. There is, of course, the soldiers sharing stories around the campfire. The tiger is ever present in them. On that actual, one step removed, 2 steps removed, there wasn't so much of a worry about the tiger. Now, of course, there might be someone in the comments might be feverishly posting, all these memoirs from all these soldiers who were worried about tiger. Maybe I just didn't see those reports, but the concern with heavy armor was primarily around the panther when it came to those.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, we've discussed this on the channel before. A perceived threat is still real to the people who have that perception, even if the threat isn't there. I mean, one of the examples I use is in 1940 in Britain, this fear of German paratroopers dressed as nuns dropping into England. Now, it never happened, but that doesn't mean the fear wasn't there. And I've spoken to enough veterans to know that tiger fear was absolutely a thing. And yet, you said yourself, a lot of Allied soldiers have walked past knocked out Panther tanks in Normandy by June the 7th, June the 8th. They're already Panther. Everyone's kind of walked past one. But yet, as you said, the Americans don't see a tiger up close in Normandy till middle of July or something, end of July. And the Brits, it takes a few days and weeks. So I think we're answering our own question. It's the fear of what you don't know is worse than the fear of what you do know.
Well, it's, and I pointed out in the conclusion of my book, if you're a tanker and a T-34 Sherman, and you're looking at a brand new 88 millimeter hole in your armor, you're not going to think, well, actually, there's 50 more tanks of my unit right now that this tiger didn't shoot that are driving over its fuel dump, and that tiger, in a few hours, will run out of fuel. You think, my tank is on fire, I need to run immediately. And it might not even be a tiger that blew a hole in your tank. But when you get back to your guys, you're going to say, a tiger blew up my tank, right? And if all 5 members of your crew say, a tiger blew up my tank, and then they tell another tank crew, and that tank crew says, oh, those guys over there, a tiger blew up their tank. It multiplies. And so, it's, even if it was a tiger and that tiger's unit is then rendered to combat ineffective because all the tigers broke down or ran out of fuel, that's not really any consolation to you. So in your memoirs, like, not to detract from veterans' kind of experiences, to them, that was devastating. Their tank got knocked out. They probably lost 1 or 2 friends in the process. They had to clamber out and run through a battlefield, through no man's land, to get back to their base. And that's, obviously an experience that leaves an emotional imprint. But we can't really, as historians, focus on the experiences of individuals, right? War is fought by millions of people, tens of millions, in order to have a representative picture. you can't focus on the experiences of one person. Then otherwise you end up, Belton Cooper's Death Traps or something like that.
Oh, don't swear
in
on
terms
the
of the
show,
soldiers.
Don't mention Belton Cooper. No, I'm joking. We're going to do a show at some point debunking that book because
Well, that was actually when I was writing my Sherman book that you see. It's my picture's mirrored up there somewhere. The most common question that I got when I posted it is, "Oh, have you read Lowes's memoirs? Oh, Lowes is something different. Oh, you disagree with Lowes, you must be wrong." Lowes was one person, right? Yeah. Belton Cooper is one person. Municipal is one person. Other Carriage is one person. Their experiences can be interesting. They can shed some light on kind of the everyday bits and pieces that weren't covered in the combat journals. They can give a little bit of color, a little bit of personality to these, dry spreadsheets. Because if you build a book of just out of technical data, no one's going to read it. Yeah. But they can't be relied upon to be represent experience. And I mean, all of these things, like when you're marching past Tiger hulls, right? I don't know if anybody in your audience ever had to walk for 12 hours to get somewhere. You're not, by hour 2 or 3, you're not really taking in the sights. You're just kind of focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. And if you're a soldier, you're stalling, you're stressed, you're looking out for the enemy. Again, when you're walking past a blown out Tiger, you're not going to see, well, if you look at the steel wheels, you can actually see that because the rubber rims are gone. The Germans are running out of rubber. They don't have time for this. They don't have the mental capacity for this. They keep walking. So, you can have a guy walk past 100 disabled Tigers, get to the camp, and tell stories about how the Tiger is invincible because he's just not paying attention to that.
So we'll do a last question. So your book is full of all these reports made by the Allies, and yet we know that the Tiger tank had reliability problems, etc. Ian's question is a representative one. Could the Tiger accommodate a larger engine and transmission, and were those planned? But a wider question is that given if the Germans had had access to the Allied reports, was there a single fairly easy thing they could have done to have made Tigers better? I mean, I'm not talking about the Tiger 2. I'm talking about the Tiger 1 or the Panzer 6. Is there some quick, easy fix they could have done that would have made it earn the reputation it kind of falsely has today?
So that's the, I guess, interesting part is the Germans were dissatisfied with the characteristics of the Tiger tank by the spring of 1942. And you might say, what? All right, that's the Tiger at that point is the heaviest, strongest in the battlefield. How can they be dissatisfied? Well, they wanted the 88 millimeter gun, the L56, was not the gun they wanted. What they wanted was the 88 millimeter Flock 41, the L71, the longer, more powerful version, but it wouldn't fit the turret. After examining the T-34, the Panzer Commission was sent to the Eastern Front in October of 41 after the Battle of Mtsensk to examine, what are these wonder tanks that stopped Guderian spearheads, right? And after that, the German tank requirements changed drastically. And so, okay, the Tiger needs to have sloped armor, right? So by the spring of 41, you see, or 42, you see this kind of new Tiger tank start to materialize, as it needs to have better armor, bigger gun. There's a bunch of other stuff they wanted to do, and they wanted to do it now. So both Porsche and Henschel were supposed to put this into production, starting with their respective 101st Tiger produced. And both companies very quickly ran into this limitation of you can't, right? The turret does not fit this gun. The hull, in order to change it to have the armor be sloped, it needs drastic changes. So, if you look at the Tiger 2 versus the Tiger, the only thing they really have in common is the name. The suspension is kind of similar, but armor layout's different, guns different, the turret's different. So Tiger has that kind of traditional German horseshoe shape, whereas the Tiger 2 has a turret reminiscent of the T-34's outlines, sloped armor, obviously, and all these other things. So there was no easy improvement you could just do to the Tiger. If there was, the Germans would have done it. We're kind of, obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, we could say, hey, how come they didn't do all these other things? But more often than not, the answer is they tried, but they couldn't.
Well, I think we'll leave it there, Peter. It's been fantastic to talk. I know I'm going to get requests to bring you back for a part 2, which we can do a part 2. I think, you know, we talked before going live. I think we're stuck with the idea people are not going to change their opinions about certain armored vehicles and certain aircraft. But if they do want to change their opinions and learn some about what was actually said at the time, I can do no better than I get. There it is, folks. Recommend the book there. There is a discount until tomorrow on the website if you go and buy it directly. They set that up. Christopher set that up. So yeah, we'll leave it there. And I know I'm going to get requests to bring you back, so we'll try and arrange that at some point later. But Peter, it's been great talking to you, folks. Thank you for your questions. I will see you again on Monday with more Monte Cassino stuff. So cheers, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Bye.